Welcome back everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administration exam. In our previous video we talked about backing up our file system using specifically the dd command. And although that these two videos may be disconnected in where they appear in the Linux Foundation Certified System Administrator course, if you haven't already viewed the video on backing up your system, if you happen to be jumping around, I suggest you go ahead and watch that particular video because we're effectively going to be undoing or taking the backups that we created during that video and restoring them in various ways or accessing the file systems within. So if you'll remember, we created a couple of directories, one called SDB1 image, which is a full backup of the SDB1 partition on our system. And we also created a vmtools.iso, which is a backup of the CD-ROM device, which happens to be a mounted version of the VMware tools, or pardon me, the VirtualBox tools for our guest operating system. Let's go ahead and make this full screen. So what we want to do is how do we restore that image file, for example? So if we look at the systems that we have available, again, we have devSDC1 and devSDB1. I've got a backup of SDB1, and I've got a file system under devSDC1 for the mount disk C1 directory. Now, I want to restore SDB1 to the SDC1 disk. So I've got this image file. Now what happens if I try to restore it to the directory? So let's go ahead and go over to the mount drive, and using our dd command, let's do an input file equal to the root and the SDB1 image file that we've created from the second hard drive. And the output file, let's try to put it M and T for mount, and let's look at disk C1 here and see what it does. Well, it tells me that that's a directory. So what I want to do is I want to actually write it directly to the partition that I want to create as a result of the image file. So because SDC1 is actually the device and the partition that contains the file system I want to restore this image to, that's what I'm going to write to. Now again, if you get the command correct, it's not going to give you a lot of input or output until it's completed its restore of the file system. Now a restore of a file system from one place to another will actually take longer than it did to create the image file, and you won't get any information until the very end of it. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this video and we'll let this finish up. Well, actually, it finished up right now. It is only a 1.1 gigabyte file system. But what it does is when it's creating the image file, it's writing to a much faster media because it's just writing to an image file on one of the local disks. What it's doing as an output of that image file is it has to read that entire structure and rebuild the structure of files and permissions and everything else that are in the image file to the new partition. So now if I look at, for example, disk B1, which is where I took my backup from, and I do a du minus sh, and I look at 41 meg, so let's do a du minus sh on Etsy, 41 meg. Let's go ahead and look at disk C1, and we need to mount the dev SDC1 to disk C1, which I'm in. So let's get out of that disk. Mount dev SDC1 to disk C1. Sudo umount disk C1. And let's look at disk C1. And we can see that in the Etsy file system, the disadvantage of what I did there is I restored the file system on an already mounted file system. So in order to pick up the changes, I had to unmount and remount the file system. So the long and short of that is if you're going to restore to a disk that's mounted, unmount the file system first. So now if I do a du-sh on Etsy here, you'll see that it matches the 41 megabytes that we had. So disk C1, 41 megabytes, disk B1, 41 megabytes for the etc directory. So I've completely restored that particular directory, and it's all of its contents from the image file to a new disk or disk partition. Now if I had updated, or rather if I had backed up the entire SDB drive, which I could have done, then it would have been regardless of the number of partitions, but then I would have had to restore it to either a single partition with enough space to restore the entire file system to, or I would have backed it up and restored it to SDC2, for example. So now what if I want to, I also created an ISO file on the file system, which was a backup of whatever was in mount CD-ROM 2. So let's just do a make directory on temp. And if I want to access the information that's either on the IMG file directly or the ISO, which is the more common method of accessing images, you can mount it just like it's any other image on the file system. You create a directory for it to be mounted under, and then you use the mount command with the appropriate options in order to access that information. So in terms of restoring, we can restore the image to a particular partition or drive, or we can mount the image itself to a particular partition or to a particular directory and access the files within it. Now, when you're doing that, you're only going to be accessing in read mode, because in order to update the ISO file or the image file, you'd have to recreate it. In this case, we're just going to mount it in what's called a loopback mode, and we're going to mount the ISO file called VM tools, and then we're going to put it here in the MNT TMP directory. And now if I look at df-h, I see that I have a mount TMP directory that's pointed to my root VM tools ISO. So now I can use that directory to copy the files or access the files that are within it, whether it's an image file or an ISO file, in a read-only mode. In other words, any changes that I make here aren't going to be reflected in the original image file unless I rewrite that image file from some location that contains the image and the changes that I've created from within that directory. So just keep in mind that if you're using image files and just mounting them, you're really only doing it in read-only mode. None of the changes are going to be reflected. They're not automatically rewritten to the image file. It has to be created. So for restoring our image files and mounting and accessing the backups themselves so that we can get to them, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.